Recently, I experienced a very sad loss. Someone who had been a dear friend for many years died unexpectedly. It was painful, and in the days that followed, I noticed a familiar temptation. Part of me wanted to hold my feelings in, to be brave, to stay strong, and carry on as though everything was fine. But that didn't really work. The grief persisted. Thoughts about my friend would intrude throughout the day. Scenes and memories would find their way into my dreams at night. It felt as though my mind kept returning to something that was needing attention, something that couldn't simply be pushed aside. What helped most wasn't advice. It wasn't distraction. It wasn't trying harder to stay positive. What helped most was sitting around a campfire with mates, talking about our friend, remembering the wonderful times we shared, and speaking openly about the sadness we were all experiencing. There was something deeply healing about having the chance to express myself and feel genuinely heard by others. And there was something equally important about listening to them, hearing their stories, their memories, their grief. Somehow, in the shared space of speaking and listening, the burden became a little easier to carry. It got me thinking about listening and about why it matters so much, about why in some of life's most difficult moments, being heard can feel so profoundly helpful, and perhaps in a world that often feels increasingly disconnected, listening may be one of the most important and compassionate things we can do. People often ask me what I think the most important therapeutic skill is. Psychologists and therapists spend years learning different therapies, models, techniques, and interventions. We learn about anxiety, depression, trauma, attachment, personality, behavior change, and neuroscience. But if I had to answer with a single word, my answer would be listening. Not talking, not advising, not fixing, listening. And perhaps that's become even more important in the world we live in today, because we live in a world that increasingly rewards the opposite. Social media platforms compete for our attention. Algorithms learn how to provoke us. Advertising constantly tries to persuade us. Political discourse often encourages us to defend our side and attack the other. Increasingly, we're surrounded by voices trying to be heard, yet despite all this communication, many people seem to feel profoundly unheard. We have more opportunities to speak than ever before, but genuine listening sometimes feels surprisingly rare. And that matters, because listening is not simply a communication skill. It's not merely a technique for therapists, leaders, teachers, or parents. Listening is an act of human connection. And I would argue that at its heart, listening is one of the most powerful acts of compassion available to us. Humans are storytellers. Long before books, podcasts, television, social media, or YouTube channels, knowledge moved from person to person through spoken word, around campfires, in village gatherings, in families, in ceremonies, across generations. For most of human history, listening wasn't optional. It was how culture survived. The ancient Greeks understood this. Socrates became famous not because he delivered great lectures, but because he asked great questions. The Socratic method wasn't really about winning arguments. It was about curiosity. It was about helping people think more deeply through dialogue, reflection, and attentive listening. Ancient Chinese traditions also placed enormous value on listening. Confucius emphasized humility, careful observation, and learning from others before speaking oneself. Wisdom was not simply about having knowledge, it was about remaining open to learning, remaining teachable, and paying attention to what others might have to offer. Many Indigenous cultures around the world, including Australian Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander cultures, have maintained rich oral traditions stretching back thousands, tens of thousands of years. Knowledge, law, identity, culture, and history were carried through story, song, ceremony, and deep listening. Elders spoke, young people listened, and one day they became the storytellers themselves. Listening wasn't passive, it was participation. It was respect. It was belonging. It was how communities maintained connection with one another, with culture, and with the generations that came before. The Romans are often credited with the saying, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth, so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." Whether they always followed their own advice is another matter, but the wisdom remains. Across cultures and across centuries, listening has consistently been recognised as one of the foundations of human community. Yet somewhere along the way, many of us began treating listening as waiting for our turn to speak, waiting to give advice, waiting to tell our own story, waiting to explain why somebody else is wrong. But that isn't really listening at all. Real listening requires something more difficult: curiosity, humility, patience, the willingness to set aside our own agenda for a moment, the willingness to be changed, even slightly, by what we hear. Genuine listening asks us to enter somebody else's world before insisting that they enter ours. In the 20th century, psychologists began studying listening more systematically, and perhaps no one influenced this area more than Carl Rogers. Rogers noticed something surprising. People often changed not because they were given brilliant advice, but because they felt deeply understood. He called this empathy, the ability to understand another person's experience from their perspective. Not agreement, not approval, not endorsement, understanding. Rogers believed that when people felt genuinely understood, they became more able to understand themselves. Unfortunately, empathy has become a controversial word in some modern discussions. Critics sometimes suggest empathy means abandoning reason, becoming emotionally overwhelmed, or automatically taking somebody's side. But that isn't what Rogers meant, and it's certainly not what compassion means. Understanding somebody is not the same as agreeing with them. Listening carefully to somebody is not surrendering your values. Trying to understand another person's perspective doesn't weaken judgment. In many cases, it strengthens it. We make wiser decisions when we have a fuller understanding of what is actually happening. From a compassion perspective, listening has a very special place. Compassion involves a sensitivity to suffering alongside a commitment to try to alleviate and prevent it. The first part is impossible without listening. How can we be sensitive to suffering if we're not willing to hear it? Listening is often the doorway through which compassion enters. Before we can help, support, comfort, advocate, or take action, we first need to understand. We need to hear the person's experience. We need to listen to their fears, their hopes, struggles, disappointments, and pain. But compassion is often misunderstood too. Compassion is not always about removing suffering completely. Sometimes there is no pain to remove. A grieving friend is still grieving. A frightening diagnosis remains frightening. A difficult situation may remain exactly as it is. Yet something important often happens when we feel genuinely heard. The need to defend ourselves can soften. We no longer have to carry the experience alone. The mind becomes less preoccupied with proving, explaining, justifying, or protecting. The threat begins to settle. And as threat settles, something else can emerge. A sense of safeness, a feeling of connection, a recognition that somebody is with us rather than trying to fix us. We experience affiliation. We feel understood, accepted, cared about, and connected. This is one of the reasons listening can be so powerful. Not because it solves problems, but because it creates the conditions in which people can think more clearly, feel more supported, and access their own wisdom and strengths. Good listening doesn't replace suffering with happiness. It transforms isolation into connection. Think about a time when you were going through something difficult. Perhaps a loss, a disappointment, a health problem, a period of anxiety. Who helped most? Was it the person with the perfect advice? Or was it the person who stayed curious, listened carefully, and genuinely wanted to understand? Many of us discover that the most healing conversations are often the ones where very little advice was given at all. What mattered was the presence of another person, someone willing to sit alongside us, listen carefully, and help us feel less alone in what we were experiencing. Carl Rogers became interested in this idea at a much larger scale. During the Cold War, he became involved in dialogue projects, bringing together people from opposing sides of major international conflicts: Americans and Soviets, Catholics and Protestants, groups carrying fear, suspicion, mistrust, and deeply entrenched differences. His observations were fascinating. When people genuinely listened to one another, something shifted. Not necessarily agreement, not necessarily compromise, but threat reduced, defensiveness softened, humanity reappeared. The other side stopped being an abstract enemy and became a person. Listening became a bridge, not because it solved every problem, but because it created conditions in which solutions became more possible. Once people felt heard, they became more capable of hearing. Once threats settled, curiosity could emerge. Once curiosity emerged, connection became possible. This insight continues today in approaches like motivational interviewing. At its heart, MI is less about persuasion and much more about understanding. We use open questions, reflections, affirmations, and summaries, not because they're clever techniques, but because they communicate something deeply important. They communicate, I'm interested in your experience. They communicate, your perspective matters. They communicate, I'm trying to understand. And those messages often reduce threat, increase trust, and create the conditions for people to think, reflect, and move forward. So what might compassionate listening actually sound like in everyday life? Perhaps it's replacing advice with curiosity. Instead of saying, you should do this, we ask, what's that been like for you? Instead of assuming, we become interested. Perhaps it's replacing judgment with understanding. Instead of asking, why would you do that? We ask, what was happening for you at the time? Instead of rushing to conclusions, we create space for stories, experiences, and context to emerge. Perhaps it's replacing certainty with humility. Instead of assuming we already know, we remain open to learning something new. Compassionate listening is often slower, quieter, and less impressive than giving advice. Yet it's often far more powerful. And maybe that's why listening feels so important right now. Because we live in a time of increasing polarization, increasing loneliness, increasing distraction, and increasing opportunities to broadcast our views. Yet opportunities for genuine understanding can sometimes feel scarce. Technology gives us extraordinary ways to communicate, but communication and connection are not the same thing. Connection requires presence, attention, curiosity, listening. The more frightened, angry, divided, and threatened we become, the more we need those qualities. We need people willing to listen across differences, within families, within communities, within workplaces, within politics, within the broader human family, not because listening magically solves every problem, but because it creates the conditions that allow solutions to emerge. Listening won't eliminate suffering, but it can transform how suffering is carried. It can reduce isolation, it can strengthen connection, it can soften threat and create space for understanding. And sometimes that alone can make an extraordinary difference. In a noisy world, listening may be one of the greatest gifts we can offer another person. It may be one of the most human things we can do. And perhaps now more than ever, it's one of the most compassionate things we can do.